This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality.
Ibn Zakaria studied the movement of the heavens. From an early age, he astounded others with his mathematical prowess. After a brief career that raised dark suspicions at the House of Wisdom, the fabled ancient academy in Baghdad, he withdrew to the shadows of a remote caravanserai in his home province. By then, he was afraid even of the singing birds. Ibn Zakaria was born in the western mountains of Persia, when silk merchants from the east still plied their trade. Even as a half-naked child playing in the dust, he proved himself a prodigy, scratching the shape of the moon and the yellow earth. He drew the earth and then the sun, then creased his brow and scuffed his foot over the markings. Within a few hours, the child showed others in the village how the mysterious silver body in the sky started shaped as a scimitar, then, over the month, widened and bulged, and then it drew back again, a deadly blade sheathed in darkness. He had completed the full lunar cycle. The villagers stared. "Impossible," said one. "A trick," said another. A few years later, before the blue smudge of whiskers appeared on the adolescent's chin, a caravan laden with wares stopped in his mountain village. The pilgrims brought rich spices, bright cloth, and strange coins, and impossible tales. They sang and shouted while their camels cropped the sparse foliage. A fat merchant was their leader. He traded Ibn Zakaria a shred of paper for a toy the boy explained would help the caravan cross the desert, a notched plank with a straw for a sight and a weighted thread for plumbness. The caravaner blustered, claiming the scrap was worth much more than the toy, because it was from a precious manuscript by a sage of mathematics in Baghdad. But he released a heavy sigh and said, as a kindness-to child, he would settle anyway. Ibn Zakaria, who was illiterate then, stood goggle-eyed at the gift, the braying camels falling silent in his ears. Wild calligraphy wound across the page like a serpent over the desert floor. He knew then, he knew in his heart what he would do with his life. A few more summers passed, and from the mysterious paper, Ibn Zakaria taught himself simple reading, but his scope was limited to figures on the page, and he yearned for more. Finally, another train of camels visited the remote village. This time, Ibn Zakaria contracted himself into servitude to get to Baghdad, his goal being to become a footman in the House of Wisdom. Perhaps then he could wheedle his way into an education. For being a peasant, he had no money. The villagers were glad to be rid of him. "A lunatic in the making," said one elder. "An apostate in the making," said another. Ibn Zakaria presented himself at the servant entrance of the magnificent institution. He was eager to set his eyes upon books and wander the cool halls among gaggles of the wise while discussing matters of universal importance. For month upon month, the only tasks given Ibn Zakaria were menial: clean stalls, water animals, grind grain. Bored by his duties, he again started scratching in the dirt, returning to his old conundrum, describing the movements of the moon and the earth and the sun. He developed a model in which a small circle rotates inside a larger circle, twice the diameter of the smaller circle. Unlike others at the House of Wisdom, he believed the orbit of the inner circle was symmetrical. It did not swing around in elastic forays. He had worked out that the rotation of the moon around the earth was fixed. That evening, a fellow stable hand snitched on his dawdling to their supervisor, who related the anecdote at supper. By a miracle of gossip, a young instructor made his way to the stable to see the curiosity. The instructor frowned. "What is this?" Ibn Zakaria's black eyes flashed as he elaborated on the curves and lines. "From a stable boy," the instructor snorted. Humbled, the youth snuck back among the sacred books when not laboring among beasts, listening to wise men talk about what they read. This way he gained the art of letters and numbers enough to estimate the circumference of the earth and dabble in the precession of apogees. In time, Ibn Zakaria constructed a device of discs made from stolen kitchen dishes, a device more complex than the toy the merchant had connived to possess. On her way back to the kitchen, a slave girl spied the youth. She asked, "But why do you make this?" Etching a fine arc upon a silver plate, Ibn Zakaria, who was growing into a handsome youth, replied, "So mariners at sea will always know where they are." "Are you going to sea? Will you take me?" she asked. "I am not going to sea." As the slave girl was favored by the captain of the guardsmen, rumor performed its wonder once again. Word spread. One afternoon, Al-Taghurai, the ancient mathematician the youth suspected was the author of his prized fragment, appeared in the courtyard where the youth was sweeping. The doddering old man meandered step by step, increasing the distance of his path by half. Still in awe of the old man, however, and fearful of punishment, Ibn Zakaria fell with his palms to the terrace floor. "Boy, show me your navigational device," Al-Taghurai croaked. The youth sped to the pallet of straw that was his bed, unearthed the silver device, and streaked back through the halls. The scholar, sallow and hunched, studied the plates. Fingering a bent rod, he said, "An astrolabe. Crude. This is the rule?" "Yes, master." The old man inquired again, tapping his dry finger on what once had been a spoon. "And this is the Eladate?" Ibn Zakaria nodded. "And why did you make this apparatus instead of tending to your chores?" The youth considered his answer this time, reflecting on the difficulties he suffered from his earlier replies. "So that true believers will be assured fidelity to the faith." Ibn Zakaria then explained the complex order of the discs, delighting over its mechanism. "With this instrument, the faithful will always know the time of day and the correct direction of Mecca." Al-Taghurai slipped the device into the folds of his robe. With a grunt, he turned away. "Master!" Ibn Zakaria cried, then produced the cherished scrap of paper from his tunic. The old mathematician paused so that the youth could deliver the paper to him. The sage carefully unrolled the sheet. "It is from a long unfinished work of mine, a critical page stolen by some bandit merchant. Without it, I have been wandering forever, like the planets through the night sky. Thank you. Now I can finish my calculations." The young man lowered his sparkling eyes. "Master, the planets do not wander." The old man stared at Ibn Zakaria. His voice cracked as if he saw a conclusion descending like an eagle over the steppe. "Boy, you must study not only the heavens, but all of mathematics and philosophy, logic, music, and optics." Under the scholar's tutelage, the new pupil made rapid progress with the instrument. Of course, when it was done, the master claimed the glory, and Ibn Zakaria accepted the trade-off. He had finally entered the house of wisdom. Within the year, however, Al-Taghurai died from a wasting illness that had long haunted him. To abate his mourning, or perhaps to put it quietly on display, Ibn Zakaria found refuge in the library. Secluded there, he produced a treatise identifying more than a dozen problems with Ptolemy's system of the planets. He unearthed scrolls attributed to the Babylonians whose celestial insights, though rudimentary, were revelatory. He criticized Plato and devoured Aristotle, and meditated on possibility and impossibility. Returning from self-exile among the texts, Ibn Zakaria was accepted now as a colleague among colleagues. Immediately, other things changed too. The volumes others found impossible to decipher opened their secrets to him. He devised a method to track the journey of the spirit from flesh as it escaped the world. He studied the distillation of elixirs and the language of birds. However, when he shared his ideas with his fellow scholars, he encountered only abrasive laughter. Alone in his cell after a heated debate in the courtyard, Ibn Zakaria fingered a tract on astrology, a suspicious science, but it was by the deceased Al-Taghurai. It explained that astrology and astronomy were sister sciences. Although he loved tallying calculations, the occult was another matter. Yet, why not? His master had trod there, and nothing seemed closed to him intellectually. The men of the academy were as ignorant as the peasants of his village. A year of isolation in the academy followed. No one spoke to him other than to address his life's essentials, for he was no longer welcome at the scholars' table. At a certain point, he was ejected from his cell and sent back to the stables and told to work for his keep. And on the last day of his year of renewed solitude, Ibn Zakaria conceived of his greatest project. He declared, if only to the camels of the stable, that he would create a different, more magnificent invention, a speculum for the skies. It would predict not only the paths of the heavens, but influence the fates of men too. However, to do that, he would need insights of a dangerous scope. Ibn Zakaria removed his master's mystic book from the library. He read it deeply, drinking in its mysteries. He helped himself to a brass plate with a lively reddish color from the blacksmith's stall. Then he fashioned dials from the brass, a backing frame, and a geared calendar with 19 wheels. All of this he overlaid with constellations of Ptolemy, corrected, of course, and laid down with lines of gold and silver wire. Lastly, he superimposed quadrants for helical and cosmic cycles, and carved otherworldly inscriptions and tokens of the zodiac. The work took the entire winter season. Ibn Zakaria barely left the stable during that time, eating the same fodder as the beasts. Finally, the instrument was complete. He laid the new device at the foot of the stable door to admire as it gleamed in the sunlight. Unexpectedly, a white vulture landed at the stable door. Ibn Zakaria stepped back, startled. The white vulture twisted its long neck. The tufts of his chest feathers shivered. In a burst, the strange bird snapped up the device and flew to the edge of the compound, where it landed and cast it into the dust. An evil omen, Ibn Zakaria cried. The portentous bird flew off in a storm of shrieks. Ibn Zakaria seized the broken device and raced back to the table. Bending over the dials, he saw how badly damaged his work was by the horny beak. The calendar gears were destroyed, the inscriptions obliterated. As he feared, the wonderful device was deeply damaged, perhaps beyond repair. He slammed his fist on the earth. He would make it again, yet better and more powerful. On an evening distinguished by a ring of fire around the moon, Ibn Zakaria sat before his divine creation. Of course, he timed the completion of his repairs to coincide with this strange lunar event. All was ready to test. On the first day of this experiment, shortly after certain turns of 19 wheels, Ibn Zakaria heard cursing from the courtyard. Two cooks stabbed each other with knives, defiling the cookhouse with their blood. On the second day, the young scholar who had abused his early invention broke a tooth, which bulged with pus. He was dead before the afternoon prayers. On the morning of the third day, the slave girls of the academy began to hang themselves, one by one. Ibn Zakaria listened to the horse choking, followed by the tinkling of rings, bracelets, and anklets from the bodies dangling from the beams. At nightfall, all the girls' corpses were laid out, and the mourners began their wailing. Clearly, his device worked, and Ibn Zakaria vowed to free himself from the academy. He knew at some point he would come under suspicion, so he stole away from the house of wisdom, his face veiled with a headscarf. The journey home seemed endless. His feet hurt and his hands swelled. His forearms grew white as powdered lead. The scarf grew stiff with filth, chafing his neck so that thin rivulets of blood ran over his chest. A dry cough racked him. The white vulture was constantly circling overhead. Other lesions followed, covering his body, but Ibn Zakaria slogged on, every gesture scorched with pain. Certain he had succumbed to a delirium, he saw, as if in a dream, enormous columns of men dressed in quilted leather, approaching from the direction of his village, an army, though none like he'd ever seen. archers with bows and quivers of arrows, while others bore axes and a sort of pike. They rode with purpose, their chainmail clattering. After them came the immense siege engines, catapults, and rolling crossbows the width of 2 prone men. Ibn Zechariah wished the army to lay scourge upon the house of wisdom, that it should burn and all its books be reduced to ash. He scraped borax crystals from the dirt, an essential ingredient for sorcery according to the occult book of his master, and unwrapped his mechanism. He lighted incense and murmured incantations as he rubbed borax on the device to fortify its power. But the incense sparked and ignited the crystals. The air burst red. Within moments, the exploded device lay flaming like an ember from a furnace. Ibn Zechariah drooled from his bleeding lips, weeping over the lump of useless brass smoldering among the rocks. And had his spell even worked? The vast concourse of soldiers swiftly covered an incredible distance, receding in huge swells to the western horizon. The white vulture fell upon a corpse dumped before the column had fully disappeared. Only then did Ibn Zechariah see that the trammeled warpath bent toward Baghdad. Time grew scattered for Ibn Zechariah. His village loomed. From the distance, however, he was disquieted. Smoke rose in a thin line from battered buildings, and people lay prone on the ground, unmoving. A stiff wind trailed down the river, and marsh birds flitted among the reeds, although their songs were like the croaking of demons to him. Ibn Zechariah knelt over a pool of water to clean himself. He carefully unwrapped the scarf that had walled in the swollen flesh of weeks, and recoiled at his reflection. The white skin, the stiff, thickened tissue, and ulcers, a face mottled as the moon. He knew the color of plague. An abandoned caravanserai sits at the foot of the western mountains of Persia. After the siege of Baghdad and the burning of the House of Wisdom and all its books by a strange, vicious army, no one passes it by anymore. Wind gathers sand over the broken terraces, now inhabited by a ghoul. The ghoul is small and crooked, and scrawls arcs and incomprehensible signs on the walls. Figures of geomancy, surely, although one cannot be sure. Someday the scrawling may cease. For now, the mad language only increases month upon month, according to the waxing of the moon. At night, the ghoul can be heard weeping. Author's note. In 1258 CE, the city of Baghdad was attacked by an army under the direction of Hulagu Khan, the brother of Genghis Khan. Its renowned academy and famed library were destroyed, if they ever existed.
That was The House of Wisdom, written and read by Vic Peterson.
Hi, Vic. Welcome back to The Strange Recital.
Hi, Brent and Tom. Thanks for having me once again. Strange Recital is a cool podcast.
Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Now, our previous conversation was about your novel, The Berserkers, a sort of heavy metal Scandinavian police dark comedy with mythic overtones, a genre unto itself. I'm glad to see you're still at it, though this story is quite different.
Yeah, for sure. This is quite different.
So, for The House of Wisdom, you've jumped from the cold north to the Middle Eastern deserts in ancient times. What was the inspiration for the story?
I knew after the Berserkers came out, I wanted to drive further into the mythic, the fantastic and legendary, even horror. That mood had been building in the Berserkers, especially in the couple of breakout chapters that were overtly fantastic. The House of Wisdom came about piecemeal from a bunch of discrete little inspirations, building blocks rather than a big flash of lightning. Maybe every story starts that way, but only after I'd written a few pages did I realize I wanted to write something that dealt with medieval magic. I started out by digging up stuff from my memory, from university classes I'd taken ages ago that were taught by a scholar of Renaissance magic. And then I started world building, to coin a phrase, but I don't think I would have been able to access the history and frame the story without the early lecture room experience that I mentioned.
Well, I've always been fascinated by how those ancient Islamic civilizations were so advanced at that time. Their pursuit of knowledge has an exoticism to it. Though the state-sponsored search for knowledge fluctuated with different rulers, of course. But is your character Ibn Zakaria based on a real person?
Yes, although there are several figures with that name in the period, and I took a lot of poetic license. But many of the aspects of the story are based on actual history. I reworked them as mise-en-scène. The comment about exoticism of knowledge struck me, so I wanted to talk about that for a second. It's going to take us a little bit away from the question you'd asked, or as you'd asked it, but here we go. Without the advanced ideas in that region at the time, as you mentioned, we would not have some key foundational knowledge of Western thought, medicine, algebra, astronomy, even the word alcohol. Medieval Islamic philosophers discovered and kept the knowledge of Plato and Aristotle alive when Europe had almost literally lost them. So I want to tease out what exoticism of knowledge was about, because one path leads to enchantment and discovery, and the other leads to a clash of civilizations and worse. Look at the path that Plato and Aristotle took to another land where they would have appeared exotic, but then gathered a new life. And then miraculously, they came back once again to be exoticized. I say exoticized because when they came back, it was the 13th century roughly, and they came back in the guise of magicians in the European courts, who also studied Aristotle and Plato. That's a long, and I hope not too boring historical digression, but I want to say I'm not into building walls. The Roman playwright Terence said it best. Nothing human is alien to me.
Well, as a kid, I immersed myself for a while in the whole Scheherazade thing. 1001 Nights of stories within stories, the source of so many great tales like Aladdin's Lamp, The Thief of Baghdad, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, Sinbad the Sailor. So I enjoyed the way your story took me into that world, but with that more scientific edge, which I liked.
Thanks. I'm delighted that you felt the vibe. I definitely aim to conjure up that kind of association. Aladdin's Lamp, The Thief of Baghdad. So many great stories. So different, and yet profoundly human.
When you submitted this story to us, you mentioned that you'd had fun imitating Borges and Marcel Schwab. Borges is very well known, of course, but Schwab seems to be remembered more for his influence on some famous writers than for what he actually wrote himself. A writer's writer, perhaps. Can you say more about him and how he influenced the House of Wisdom?
Schwab is definitely a writer's writer. The fact that he's little read outside writing circles has, I believe, something to do with the complexity of his subjects and his literary style. He wrote mainly short fiction, fictionalized tales based on intensive portrayal of detail. In other words, what is now called flash fiction, but was really intensive and granular. It requires a lot of work on the reader's part. Schwab was French from a Jewish family, writing in the late 19th century. He's associated now, rather, with the writers that are usually grouped as decadents, including Oscar Wilde. Wilde is probably the most well-known of all those folks. But as a reader, you have to have patience working through Schwab. The payoff is there if you can tolerate the effort.
Well, I appreciated being introduced to Schwab. I'd never heard of him. Another great story that was brought to mind by the House of Wisdom, especially the army at the end, was by J.G. Ballard, The Garden of Time. Are you familiar with it?
The Garden of Time. Wow, I am a huge fan of The Garden of Time. That story is high on my list of great literature. and it's always lurking around in my mind.
Your description of the instrument Ibn Zachariah builds reminds me of the Antikythera mechanism, the earliest known analog computer discovered in the sea off the Greek island of Antikythera. It was used to predict astronomical positions and eclipses. Was Ibn Zachariah's device influenced by this?
Yep, the Antikythera is definitely a cousin of Ibn Zachariah's device. I did a little, noodling around with that subject while I was sorting out what Ibn Zachariah's device was going to be.
You clearly have some knowledge of the astrolabe since you mentioned a couple of its components by name. It was an amazing instrument for mapping the stars, navigating, calculating. I'm always humbled by the minds that could invent something like this in a time long before technology as we know it today. When I did a Google search, the AI response included this rather facile bit of understatement, which I found funny. The concept of the astrolabe has been revived in the form of the smartphone.
Oh, yeah. Relating the astrolabe to the smartphone is a big stretch. Like saying a matchstick is the precursor of the TIG welder. True, I guess, but it ends up being just kind of bland hyperbole.
Yeah. Now, tell us about the white vulture. In your book, The Berserkers, 2 ravens are featured. Do birds have a special significance for you?
Oh, birds are wonderful. But the truly special place in my heart for birds is as a writer. They make terrific spooky omens and harbingers. You can read virtually anything into a bird.
Interesting that the language of the birds is considered in mystical and occult traditions as some sort of perfect secret language.
The language of discovery.
Well, these days, scientists say that birdsong has its own grammar, so it is in fact a language of some kind. But Vic, what other writing projects are you working on?
Right now I have 2 big projects. The first is a novella that tells the Rumpelstiltskin story from the perspective of Rumpelstiltskin. And the second is a fiction podcast, which is a single story told over 6 episodes that I'm doing with a longtime friend of mine. The protagonist is a magician who's maybe a cross between Gandalf and Penn and Teller. I really like the narrative podcast. It has a lot of great challenges in that anything magical in my story has to be conveyed through audio cues and verbal communication. And it's quite a fun challenge, and one that I'm sure the Strange Recital knows well.
Yes, we do. I'm looking forward to reading more. Thanks for joining us again, Vic.
Yes, thank you.
I love the Strange Recital. I was super glad, by the way, when you guys got that memorial award from the Dactyl Foundation. Very well deserved, and it probably keeps the lamps of imagination burning.
Sorry, what did you say?
That sounds very much like a black-footed albatross, if I'm not mistaken. This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was from Cry of the Desert by Mark Wilson X. This is episode 25031.